so in Weedflower, I mentioned that some people actually burned their kimonos because they were afraid that if they were found, it would seem like they were too Japanese or disloyal. So some of these kimonos probably ended up getting destroyed. So sometimes when I show this to kids, and of course you're all older, but I just give them context, talk about the 1930s, and this is just pictures. There was of the Dust Bowl. You know, there was a very severe drought in the Midwest, and there were these huge clouds of dust that would just fill the sky. And so this is 1941. This is video. I'm not sure why someone was videotaping it, but this is the actual bombing of Pearl Harbor. Sorry about the dogs. So my mom actually lived in Hawaii at this time. And so she was never interned, because if you lived in Hawaii, you know, a lot of the people who lived in Hawaii were Japanese. So, you know, there wasn't really racism against Japanese because, you know, there were so many of them there. And so she said she used to have to carry a gas mask to school after the bombing, and that she also had to change her name. So she was born Akiko, and she had to change her name to June. Her sister was named Takako, and she had to change her name to Jean, or they weren't allowed to go to school. So I guess you weren't allowed to have a Japanese name when you went to school. So this is the front page of the LA Times the next day. And people would make up these little cards and stuff. There was just, you know, there was a lot of animosity against not just Japanese from Japan, but, you know, Japanese Americans. And so this was a report. President Roosevelt commissioned a report from a trusted friend to see, and he wanted to know if the Japanese were loyal or not. And actually, what the report says is that you know, the man who went to investigate said he thought the Japanese were in more danger from white people than vice versa. But for whatever reason, Roosevelt decided to intern Japanese all along the West Coast. So the little kids wore tags because they didn't, with their numbers on it. Every family had a number, and you didn't want to lose your kids, so you put tags on them. This is them getting on the train. They weren't sure exactly what was going. They didn't really know really what was going on. Some of them thought they were going to be killed even. And they would wave flags and, you know, just try to show how loyal they were really. So a lot of these people, most of them were farmers. Some of them, I interviewed a family of flower farmers. I actually interviewed quite a few flower farmers for this book. And there was one guy who was especially interesting. He said I interviewed him mostly about flower farming, but after we were done, he said, you know, the camps really were not that bad. And then he suddenly started crying. And so, you know, he's saying it's not that bad, but at the same time he was crying, and he was in his 80s. So, you know, it was very traumatic, I think, for him. And so this is Little Tokyo. You know, Black people were not allowed to live wherever they wanted. And so when they came to the Los Angeles area to live, they stayed in Little Tokyo because there were jobs there, I guess, in support of the war. And so this is a family in Little Tokyo. This is people arriving. As I'm sure you all know, you were allowed to bring as much as you could carry. This is a famous photograph because I forget who took it. One of these men later, I wouldn't say he was outspoken, but he would just talk about. He was a little more outspoken than a lot of people. Like my dad, I interviewed for this book, and he really didn't have that much to say. He said he couldn't remember. This is at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And this is a barrack that they brought over from Wyoming, where I forget how many people lived per per square foot, but this one I think was only one room. There were a very small number of actual colored photographs from the camps. And one of the things that always intrigues me about the camps is that everybody went to great lengths to just look nice every day and, do their hair and wear nice clothes and so on. There were about 6,000 babies born in camp. This is a Mojave home at that time. And so this is right near where Poston was located. They didn't have running water or electricity. And so there was some resentment because the Japanese did have running water and electricity. This Poston. And so a lot of people would water down the dust because there would be these huge dust storms and the dust would get into the cracks in the barracks. So the Japanese were expert gardeners, and they turned barracks like this into barracks like this. This is my dad. He was drafted out of Poston. And so this is him after he was drafted. He said when he was he said he could be in uniform and he would go off base and try to go to a restaurant and they wouldn't serve him. They would ask him to leave even if he was in uniform. So the Japanese all served together. He served actually he went to Japan and right after the war because the war ended while he was still in training. And so he worked as an interpreter in Japan. And so this is my mom and dad. They met at a dance. My mom says that a friend of hers said something like, "We're having a party. We need one more girl." And so she went to the dance and she met my dad. They got married fairly quickly. Okay, that's me on the right. This might be the picture. My Uncle Donald says that he was trying to take a picture of me and I was crying and I was telling him what a bad man he was. And so this might be the picture. So this is my dad. He worked as a chicken sexer. And this is when he was older. Just want to make sure I don't go over. This is when he was older. He worked as a chicken sexer all his life. There were no, windows because they didn't want you to be distracted. You didn't have health care or anything like that. This is me. I'm the one on the right. My mom yelled at me for this picture because she said, if you don't have clothes on, you should hide behind the dog. This is my dad again, as when he was older. The reason they wore masks is because there was a lot of little downy fur that came out of the chickens. So chicken sexing is when you separate the male chickens from the females. This is where I lived for a while in Springdale, Arkansas. Again, this is all Arkansas where I lived and where my dad worked as a chicken sexer. And so I wrote about all of that in Kira Kira, which was my first children's book. So this is a page from Weedflower. And I think my editor and I worked on that book and did at least seven drafts. And so every page looks like this. It's incredibly disillusioning to kind of you hand in your manuscript and you think, wow, I'm such a genius. And then of course she just slashes entire paragraphs and entire pages. Sometimes she'll just slash through the entire page and say, no, that doesn't work. And so this is just some of the stuff I had to read and some of the manuscripts for Weedflower. And I dedicated it to my dad. So this is a thing that this is the questionnaire that they were given in camp. And the purpose of the questionnaire, all the grown-ups were given this questionnaire, and it was to prove your loyalty. They wanted to determine who was loyal and who was not. And so, for instance, question 24 says, list magazines and newspapers to which you have subscribed or have customarily read. And then 27 and 28, I think I mentioned them in Weedflower. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And so a lot of people wrote things like, I will serve if you return my family civil rights. And if you wrote that, that was considered a no answer. And you were called in for an interview and they would interview you. If they didn't like what you said, then they marked you as disloyal. And so the ones who were considered loyal were drafted. This is the 442nd. It was an almost all Japanese combat unit. They were one of the most decorated combat units in military history. A lot of them died. So again, when I talk to kids, I just show them, from other parts of the world what was going on. I think this one is from London. These are kids in a bomb shelter. I think this is from what is now Belarus. And so if you were considered disloyal, you were sent to a camp called Tule Lake. And this is Tule Lake. And it was a very, there were a lot of protests there and there was a lot of unrest there. They were put under martial law. There were searches of everybody's barracks. And so a lot of, and this is some men getting arrested after a protest. I think they were protesting, they thought some of their food was being given to other people. And so I'm not sure, I actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure what the protest was over. But anyway, so then a lot of the protesters and a lot of the leaders of the protests were arrested. And they were put in this little, it was called a stockade, and they were never charged with a crime. And written records show that they were kept in jail for months at a time. And some of the reasons were stuff like, he's too well educated for his own good, but there were no, they were never charged with the crime. They were just kept in this little stockade for months. And I went to Tule Lake in 2006. This is what the stockade looks like today. And so a lot of the Japanese there, 6,150 Japanese in Tule Lake renounced their citizenship. And so many of them were deported to Japan. And I say deported, many of them who were sent to Japan had never been to Japan, but they had renounced their citizenship through anger and just through, it was just very stressful in Tule Lake. And so they were sent to Japan. This is their arrival in Japan. So the children here, children were not allowed to renounce their citizenship. So the children were still considered citizens of the US. This is Hiroshima before the bomb. It was a very, very busy and city. And so this is the city before the bomb, and this is the city afterwards. The kids wore masks because the smell of dead bodies was everywhere, and that's why they wore masks. There were a lot of orphans, a lot of homeless people afterwards. These are soldiers, and so some of these soldiers had actually done, terrible things in during the war, and then they came back as broken men, really. So this is one of this is one of the men I interviewed actually for Weedflower. He was his family was they were called no boys if you were disloyal, and they renounced their citizenship, and he was sent to Japan. He's still alive actually, and he said they looked very different from the native Japanese, and they were kind of excluded in a lot of ways. So this man is, this isn't really about Weedflower. This is more about my book, A Place to Belong. This is Wayne Collins, and he was a lawyer, and he got the citizenship back for every single person who wanted it. And he did it individually because he wasn't allowed by the courts to do a class action. And so he started in 1946, and one by one, he went before the court. And sometimes he hardly got paid. He didn't do it for money. And so in 1968, the last person who had renounced their citizenship and wanted it back got it returned, and all because of this man. And so that woman on the right, her name is Margie. She lives in San Marino now. She became a doctor, but this is her in Japan. Her family weren't, they renounced their citizenship, and she was sent to Japan. This is a tree in Hiroshima. Somehow it survived the bombing. It's still alive today. This is Hiroshima today. And this is the cover from A Place to Belong. Okay, sorry I started talking about A Place to Belong, but it kind of all meshed into each other. That's it. I just, I wrote Poston really for my dad, and this other book, A Place to Belong, I felt it was the other side of the story. Like Weedflower was the story of the people who cooperated, and A Place to Belong was the story of the people who protested, really. Okay, I'm gonna stop the share, and we're back.
Oh, thank you so much. It was brilliant. It was excellent. It makes me think about a lot of things about this history, and like seeing all these extra photos just opens a whole new aspect about the novel and the real history of behind of this fiction. So thank you. I have a lot of questions that I would like to ask, but I'll give the first opportunities to the students and the audiences to join this event today. So if you want to ask questions, please raise your hand. Okay, here, Kaya. Kaya, you can ask a question. You're muted now. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Ms. Kadohata. I just want to say I'm a big fan of Weedflower, and I'll actually be writing my midterm paper about it. So with that, I just have a couple questions about the effects of Asian discrimination within the US and the historical significance of the Japanese internment camps. So one of my topics I'll be writing about is historical negationism, and it's the falsification or distortion of the historical record. It is a notion that historical events in the past are misconstrued and not recognized for the truth. I think the US government and military take pride that they can pick and choose which historical events they deem significant to them. So my question is, how has a lack of acknowledgement from the US government around the internment camps contributed to historical negationism? Or in other words, what do you think of the US and its capability of hiding the significant history of Asian American discrimination?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, it was the schools almost, and it was academia who they were really on the forefront of bringing a lot of this forward. And because every year there were these pilgrimages to all the camps, and so very elderly people would go there, and some young people too. But a lot of the people going were students, and they were the ones who really started bringing the story forward. Like, I didn't really even know that it wasn't, in other words, it wasn't the government so much that started acknowledging some of the things that had happened. It was really, I think, academia. And so they get a lot of credit for that, really, because I don't think the story would be being told today if not for that. Like I took a class in college, and that was the first time I really started thinking about the internment. I knew that it had happened, but we didn't really, I don't believe it was ever mentioned in school. And it was really in college where people started asking me about it. I took some classes, and so it was transformational. Like, I think, and I don't know if this is still true, I hope it is, but for me, college was really, it transformed my view of the world in a lot of ways. And I love classes like this because they will tell the story of what happened, right? So like, it's not going to be the government, it's going to be people making the government acknowledge it. If that even answers your question.
Well, that was great. Yes, I definitely agree. I think classes such as Professor Yu's class, this class in general, really helps like acknowledging historical significance like of Asian Americans, which I personally really appreciate. And then I just had one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
As a writer shedding light to such historical events, how do you think Asian Americans are misrepresented in the film industry through stereotypes?
So I don't really watch that many films, but I mean, there aren't that many films with Asian Americans, really. So I'm not even sure how to answer that, because over the years it's been sort of wasn't there some kind of nerdy glasses character in some teenage movie? I forget what it was called, and it was the worst kind of stereotype, as I recall. And so it's probably changed over the years. I don't know. I hardly ever see stories that are very much centered around Asian Americans. So I don't even know how to answer that. I would love to hear what you have to say. Like, what do you feel about that?
My other topic in my paper is about this novel we also read, Interior Chinatown. And it kind of is written about, gives generic stereotypes about Asians within the film industry. So the main character is striving to be this generic Asian role, the Kung Fu guy. And it's just kind of talking about the limiting roles within film that are given to Asians. So like Kung Fu guy, Oriental, China man, things like that. And it's just very, I think, stereotypical. And there's a pattern within films that Asians are represented in these ways that are kind of insignificant characters. They're never the main character given the spotlight. Although I think in the recent years that's changed with films like Crazy Rich Asians or Farewell. But I still think there's still misrepresentation and given stereotypes among Asians. But, yeah. Thank you for answering my questions.
Oh, thanks for asking. Thanks.
Thank you, Kaya. Is there any other Person who wants to ask questions? Anyone? Yeah. Yeah, you can unmute there and speak up.
Okay,
Let me figure this out. I'll turn it off.
hello. Hello. Okay, that works. Okay. Hello.
Hello.
I just have a quick question of why did you choose to write this novel for young adults instead of like it's such a heavy topic, and I feel like it's just not something that I would think to write for like a young adult audience.
I think for me, even when I was writing adult books, they were usually young characters. Sometimes I think I just stopped maturing or something in life. And it's just really easy for me to slip into a young character. And so really it was just a personal choice. I wasn't thinking, it's just too heavy for young people. I was just thinking it just feels so much more natural to me. And it just, I chose to write it at that time, I guess, because I was just, my dad was getting older and my parents had gotten divorced and I had kind of not, I felt like I had not acknowledged him enough. And, when you're younger, you don't really appreciate your parents the way you do later. And so I just wanted to do this for him really. And so a lot of it was just, it was personal. And to me, it was for my dad in a lot of ways. And it's just easier for me to write from a kid's point of view. I would love to, there are times though when I'm writing and my editor will say this is not really appropriate for kids. And so I would love to just kind of feel unleashed maybe sometimes and just do a more adult book, but at the same time it's easy for me to write from a young person's point of view. So that was really the only reason.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, you can speak louder. Here's some microphone if you want to.
Do you think writing from a child's perspective provides a better view of the history than, say, if it was from an adult's perspective?
That's a really interesting question. I think a child doesn't quite, it's harder to get some things across because a child doesn't quite understand everything that's happening and why it's happening. And so you have to get it across in other ways. It might actually, sometimes I actually think if something is more difficult, the book comes out better because you're sort of pushing against this difficulty and it just is more, you work harder, you're more inspired and so on. So in certain ways, even though a child's perspective is you could say, and they will not understand certain things that a grown-up will, it makes it just more challenging. And that just, I don't know, I think pushing against limits makes something come out more profound. And I don't know why that is. It's not, I think it's kind of a rule almost in writing, and I don't really know, why that is. So.
Thank you, Cooper. Anyone? Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a story. So when I was in like 4th grade, so I'm from Washington, we went on a field trip to Puyallup, which is where there were Japanese internment camps. And we Japanese like civil rights activist, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was talking about when they were rounding up all the Japanese people, I think it was like 20-ish, he went and got plastic surgery on his eyes to like make them like white eyes, I guess. And but they're still like, you're a Japanese guy, like you're not fooling anyone with that. But I guess my question was like, how did your parents or grandparents feel about like living in a society where you're like discriminated on things like that, and how like, yeah, I'll say good at that.
I would say my mom was more, she would think about these things more. My dad was very, I like the phrase that's used in Weedflower, shikata ganai, right? It can't be helped. And so my dad was more like that. He was just, he got out of camp and he said, he just felt his path forward in life was getting married and having kids. It was just what he wanted to do. And so for him, he didn't really question things. He accepted things. He worked hard, and I asked him once why, because he worked really hard. My dad worked really hard, and I said, "Why did you do it?" And he said he wanted his kids to go to college, and we did. And so for him, he feels like he got what he wanted. He wanted to have kids, and he wanted them to go to college. And my mom was more, she was always questioning things and kind of, she doesn't really accept things. My mom is a lot more rebellious than my dad.
And so you showed us the photo of your mom and dad when they met, but so they met in Japan while your dad was there?
No, so actually they met in Chicago. So my mom lived in Hawaii, and then after the war, I'm not sure my mom would be mad at me for saying this. Basically what happened is her dad drowned off the coast of Hawaii, and her mom got pregnant by somebody else, and so she didn't know what to do, and so she moved to Chicago, and because she had other family who had moved there. They had been in Manzanar. The rest of her family went to Manzanar, and so after camp they went to Chicago, and so she went there to be with them, and that's where my mom met my dad.
Thank you. And the I have another question. Like the 42 regiment, right? The Japanese. So they were they fought mostly in Europe, right? Or
yes, so they fought only in Europe, I think, and they got sent to the most difficult battles. In other words, in a lot of ways, I think they were considered expendable almost, right? There was one battle where they rescued some people, but I think it was something like more of them died than were actually rescued. And so they were considered, that's a really hard one, just send them. And so that's why a lot of them, died.
Right. Yeah, Derek, you have laptop?
It's big from here.
Okay, come here.
Hello.
Hi.
So, like you hear about a lot of writers when writing about something that is, not necessarily falls within the regular realm of American literature of like the white protagonist. There's this sort of pressure or like feeling like needing to do it justice. And we read about this with a previous author that we were talking about in the class, and I was wondering, like, for you, did you experience that in writing Weedflower? And because you also were talking about like how it's like for your father, and if you did experience that sort of pressure to like do the experience justice, how did you manage that?
Yes, you really do feel that, not just for my dad, but even for the flower farmer I was talking about, who was crying, and there was another guy too who I particularly remember. So he became a doctor, and so I interviewed him, and then he said, if you promise you will never, show this to anyone, I'm going to show you some writing that I did about the camp. And he said, he just doesn't want the FBI to get a hold of it. Like he was in his 90s, and he was genuinely fearful that he might get in trouble for what he had written about the camps. And so he gave it to me, and actually it was very, it was just very mild, really. It was just sort of describing the camps. And so, all these people who, even into their 90s, they're still feeling fear or all this emotion. So yeah, it felt like a lot of pressure. And I think a lot of help that I get when I'm feeling pressured is from my editor, because she's also a good friend of mine. And so I feel like we're working on it together. And it is a lot of pressure, because you don't want to get it wrong, and there is no way to handle it, really. You just have to go through it. So
Right. Thank you so much. I think the time's up, almost up. Do you have any final comment you want to make before we end this?
no, I just, it's amazing. It's amazing because, when you think of the fact that I think of my dad going through all this, and my mom's family, and then just to think that, people are talking about it now. I mean, I think it's amazing, and I think it's, it's so wonderful that
People
yeah.
like you who are exploring this hidden history and who bring this up into the light, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, right? As people living in the United States to know this history. So, and thank you so much for today's great speech and the answers. It was I need time to tie these thoughts and spin my head around, but it was so great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll
Thanks.
follow up by email. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.
Have a good
Good.
semester.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.